Well, I think we completely lost the last broadcast. Some shade of it might show up in this series or on the YouTube, but I'm going to have to repeat because I spoke one and a half seconds over my 10 minutes. Anyway, we we've looked at King Herod and looked at his personality and not wishing to follow Mark Antony's words in William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar that the evil that men do live after them, the good is often interred with their bones. We have tried to point out some of the good points of Herod as well, but to show in his character as we know it from history, he was capable of such an evil deed as is described in the scripture by the killing of the infants in Bethlehem. If it was done quickly enough, Caesar, of course, wouldn't have been able to have intervened and might not have anyway. But anyway, Herod was capable of that. He was capable of great generosity and of great wickedness. Brilliant general, brilliant strategist, brilliant an architect as well. He was a genuinely brilliant man of his era. But anyway, we had, I believe what we were trying to answer was about the fleeing away into Egypt. And as we mentioned in the probably lost broadcast, Joseph and Mary would not have been going into some complete uncertainty going into Egypt. There was a large Jewish community in Alexandria, a very cultured and with a well-developed intelligentsia there. The scripture had been translated into Greek in Alexandria, and I believe at the request of the King Ptolemy of Egypt, who tried to collect all the books in the world into his library and have things translated into Greek so they could be read. In any case, Joseph and Mary might even have had relatives of some kind in Alexandria, because as we see, Mary wasn't from some simple peasant family. She was very highly connected with the priesthood. And Joseph was also not just some simple peasant either. He was connected to a very important family. And he was a craftsman. A carpenter was a craftsman. And so they would have expected to find some kind of reception and shelter in Alexandria, and perhaps even with relatives. And again, we don't know the time frame. We don't know how long it was before the Magi came and talked to Herod about the king that they'd come to see. They certainly traveled a very great distance. And we know that Mary and Joseph remained for some time because Christ was circumcised as the law prescribed, and he was presented in the temple for the purification and was received in the arms of the aged prophet and testified to by Hannah the prophetess as well. And so they'd gone into Egypt at a certain time, and again we don't know what that time frame was exactly because nothing is mentioned about it, but some time had passed since the birth of Christ and since the incarnation of God, before the wise men would have arrived, and these other things took place. So Herod was calculating children under, 2 years old, just to make sure. I suppose he gave himself a buffer. But going into Egypt and finding the Jewish community in Alexandria, there were all kinds of details that illumine this flight into Egypt and that show us that the connections in the gospel story with the realities of the world in which people lived. And I think we also mentioned about the manger cave. We do have other corroboration about people having to travel to their native towns in order to pay the taxes to the Roman Empire. We have papyrus from Egypt where people are complaining rather bitterly about it. And when Joseph and Mary would have gone down to Bethlehem, it wasn't just people of the house and lineage of David who had had to go, but people whose ancestors were Bethlehemites. And so it would have been quite a few people, and a lot of them perhaps no better connected than David and Mary, than Joseph and Mary, to the house of David and to the priesthood, nevertheless would have been senior. A lot of them would have been older. And the ones who came from Jerusalem and Ein Karim and places like that, Hebron perhaps, would have been so much closer than those coming from Nazareth. Consequently, by the time Joseph and Mary would have gotten there, they didn't travel alone. They would wait for some kind of a caravan or something to go and travel with a group of people. You didn't just travel alone out across the desert or something in those days. They would have gotten there fairly late, and things would have been full. The whole city would have been filled. Now, I recall when, even in the time of my aunt, when she was a small girl, living in the prairies, people traveling across the prairies, and still sometimes in wagons, would stop when they needed rest, and there often wouldn't be very much room in a small farmhouse, but they were allowed to sleep in the barn. And they would just go to wherever the hay was and sleep on the hay, and stay perhaps 1 or 2 days, and then travel on to where they were going. And my aunt remembers that happening, people sleeping in their barns. And consequently, in an older time, well, the manger caves, which are on that cliff face along Bethlehem, would have been a decent shelter. A fire would have kept them warm, and there would have been hay and supplies there for the animals. Shepherds slept there regularly, and so it wouldn't be unnatural that they would have slept there in a manger cave. That's something that in an older culture, even here in North America, people traveling across the prairies in Canada or the plains in America, if they came to a farm, they would happily sleep in the barn and sleep in the hay. So all of this narrative from the scripture is perfectly logical, and particularly within that time frame and in that culture and society. And that's the main thing we wanted to touch upon because of the questions that had arisen. Now, I don't remember if it was the previous broadcast that got online or the one that I just lost a few minutes ago, when we were talking a little more about, someone had asked me about the difference between the nativity story in Matthew's Gospel and the nativity story in Luke's Gospel. And I had begun to point out that there's a disparity in the Gospels, and for a logical reason at that. As we know, Paul did not write with his own hand all of his epistles. The book of Romans, for example, the letter to the Romans, ends with I, Tertius, who wrote this epistle, and of course Paul would have signed it to certify that it was actually from him. Well, the other apostles might not have written either. After all, John dictated the Apocalypse of the Revelation to Prochorus, who was acting as his scribe. Mark traveled with Peter. They were in Alexandria together. And Mark ended up having quite a substantial impact upon the Egyptian Orthodox Church, including the Gospel attributed to St. Mark. So Mark would have written the reminiscences of Peter, perhaps what Peter taught the crowds that came together, the congregation, and would have taught in sermons and his reminiscences and things. And Mark would have recorded those as Peter related them to him, and perhaps even a good bit of it from memory after Peter had departed and gone on to Rome. So this is why we find this kind of disparity in the Gospels. Luke researched to find the history. We're not too sure where Matthew gained his knowledge, but in any case, there is a little bit of difference in the story, in that part of it is not there in Luke's Gospel, it is there in Matthew's Gospel. And we'll touch on that a little more later.